Hey everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the Progressive Era. This is a period from about 1890 to 1920. And what happens during this era is it is a big response to things that have occurred during the Industrial Revolution. So people begin to look to government and look to ideas of social change uh, to fix some of the errors of the previous era. So let's first look at some of the widespread problems of society. While industrialization had offered a lot of opportunity for people, opportunity for a lot of people to grow rich, a lot of people were slaves to wages and lived in poverty. This example of Louis Birch here, he's a 12-year-old. He had to sell newspapers to help his mom. His father had died the previous year, so he was no longer available to bring in money and income. And Louis worked 9 hours a day until 12:30 a.m. every morning. So you see how like poverty is systemic. It affects people all over. People working for wages were often stuck in slums or tenement housing. The problem with this, they lived in filth. They lived on top of each other. And part of that was that 25 children died before they turned 1 year old. Sanitation was so bad, living conditions were so bad that children didn't have a chance to grow up often. As a result of the free market and no government oversight, there's also often a lot of labor abuse, as we've seen. You can see that in an example of what happened in the Triangle Factory fire. So 1 week before the Triangle Factory fire, a factory owner was warned by a government inspector that his business was a fire trap, that the escapes were not working, that the layout of his business wasn't proper, that his fire hose was not working. He responded to this that said, let them burn. There are a lot of cattle anyway. We don't care. We're not worried about it. When the factory did catch fire, over 140 people died. There was also no consumer protections like we have today. The free market was let to run completely uncontrolled, and that's what led to that great growth, but also led to an idea of like customers being cheated. People didn't often know what they were buying. And you can see that in this excerpt, this disgusting excerpt from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, when he talks about the conditions in a meat packing factory. It says there was the least attention paid to what was cut for the sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be doused with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled onto the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had trampled and spit uncounted billions of germs. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, dung, and meat would go into the hoppers together. So you can see no one is checking what's happening in these factories. They're just throwing everything together. It's absolutely disgusting and dangerous. And there was the environmental damage that was occurring as a result of industrialization. You can see here the smokestacks, air pollution happening, but also poisoning the rivers, just dumping sewage in the rivers, dumping oil, dumping factory waste in rivers. In the water supply, there's no environmental regulation. No one cared at all for the environment. There was also political corruption, such as the political corruption of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall and the Democratic Party in New York City. Um, Boss Tweed stole $200 million from New York City residents. So what he did, take in taxes, and he would pay for services, pay for goods, but highly overcharge them and pocket money for himself and for his cronies. So what happens is the New York courthouse costs $13 million to build. So that's $178 million in today's money. One carpenter was paid $360,000 for 1 month worth of work. That's $4.9 million today. So they would pocket that money, spread it to their friends. A plasterer was paid $133,000 for 2 days of work. That is $1.82 million for 2 days of work. So this political corruption is really stealing money from the people and spreading it around to corrupt officials. And all this industrialization was affecting farmers. It was marginalizing farmers. So what happened is the railroads charged higher prices for farmers than other customers. But the farmers had no other alternative to get their product to market. They had to use the railroads. So the railroads had them trapped. And so the number of farm bankruptcies skyrocketed as a result of this. There was rampant racial discrimination, in particular in the South, with the Jim Crow laws, the segregated society, and also during this period, you see massive growth in the use of lynchings and widespread lynchings. And you see a depiction here of lynchings. These were usually extrajudicial. They weren't even taken to court. People would just murder African Americans to kind of keep them in fear. And you could see this picture here, this disgusting picture, really. And the most horrifying aspect of this picture might be the smiling person there to the right. These people are happy of what's happening here. They're murdered people. So this is horrible, horrible racial discrimination. But there was also sexual discrimination. Women were considered second-class citizens. They didn't have the right to vote or participate politically at all. They had limited opportunities. They were getting more opportunities to work, but for those jobs they worked, they were paid 1/2 of what men received. So you could see the discrimination exist in all forms. There was also a problem of drunkenness in society. As people moved to the city, began to work for wages, congregate, alcohol is more readily available. Public drunkenness becomes a problem. Drunkenness everywhere becomes a problem. And you get what is known as the temperance movement. This is a movement against alcohol. People begin to see alcohol as a societal problem. So they move towards temperance or trying to taper the consumption of alcohol. So really, what were the solutions to these societal problems? In many ways, it was ending the policy of laissez-faire, of ending the policy of government being hands-off. And what this marked is what's known as the Progressive Era. In particular, this could be seen as 1900 to 1914. This is when it really hit full stride. But the goal was to fix those problems of the Industrial Revolution, and the method of doing that was through government regulation. Government would now help fix these societal problems. So there were really several goals in the Progressive Era to progress society through government intervention. The first goal was political goal. This was to increase democracy and stop the political machines from bribing people and intimidating voters. Allow people to get out and vote. Make their votes count. One of the goals was economic. Increase opportunity by fighting trust, breaking up those monopolies, allowing more companies to enter the market, allowing workers to have more options. And then there were social goals. The idea of fighting discrimination, protecting consumers and children, and improving living conditions for citizens. The Progressive Era really got moving by the muckrakers. The muckrakers were progressive writers who made the public aware of the problems of the Industrial Revolution. So you think they're raking up the muck. They are bringing up what's the dirt, letting everybody see it. And they actually use the term the Gilded Age for this Industrial Revolution. Basically, what that means is gilded means it's something that's covered in gold. So saying like they're covering things in gold, but underneath there's all this muck, all these people are suffering, but these people are super rich and you can't tell. So there are several important works written by these muckrakers to expose the corruption in society, to expose the different levels of society that existed. One of these is Ida Tarbell's The History of the Standard Oil Company, which really exposed some of the practices of the monopoly of the trust, and in particular John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Lincoln Steffens' The Shame of the Cities really exposed the double standard in the cities, where you had super rich people living off the labor of these really poor people living in slums and tenement houses, and kind of showed how the other half lived. And then you had Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was about the meatpacking industry in Chicago, which we've read excerpts from, which I had an excerpt from earlier, which really exposed the terrible conditions in these meatpacking factories, in these industries. So while the muckrakers got people fired up, they also made government realize that they had to do something. And one of the ideas of this, and one of the big ideas, is that the idea of regulating big business. So you can see the idea that monopolies and trusts were a problem for the United States, depicted here in this cartoon. You can see the snake represents a monopoly getting ready to strike Lady Liberty with its tail wrapped around the dome of the Capitol building. So what happens is the government realizes they have to do something. So the first significant aspect is the Northern Securities case. This was in 1906. This was the first time the Supreme Court made a decision that monopolies and trust could be broken up. And what this does, it allows the government to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed during the Industrial Revolution, but which had never been used to break up these large trusts. Um, Furthermore, the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed. This act helped even further from the Sherman Antitrust Act. And what this did was protect unions, allow workers to join unions, allow joining unions to go on strike easier, and it also outlawed the practice of price fixing, basically to help farmers who were getting ripped off by the railroads. The government also passed acts to protect consumers because of the stuff the muckrakers had written. The Meat Inspection Act was passed in direct relation to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. The horrors that have been displayed in that book, they were like, we have to do something about this. So they allowed inspectors to inspect the meatpacking industry. And then the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. This would lead to the modern day FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Basically what this does is give inspectors the ability to check where foods and drugs are coming from when they're brought to market. The government also stepped in this period to try to stabilize the economy, make it more predictable, and make it more fair. Teddy Roosevelt was the president during this time, and he created the idea of a square deal. He wanted to create a fair society for everybody. And so he wanted to create an economy that worked better for everybody. But they also want to stabilize the economy by stabilizing the monetary supply. This created the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the monetary supply by setting interest rates. So this is the first time in history this has happened. This is not the laissez-faire route of supply and demand. Now there is a Federal Reserve which controls money to try to control how the economy goes. Roosevelt was also an avid outdoorsman and is responsible in a lot of ways for really protecting the environment or beginning environmental protections. So it was under Teddy Roosevelt that the National Park System and the Forest Service were created. You can see Roosevelt here in front of the Yellowstone Falls in Yellowstone National Park. This was the world's first national park. And so this really, people begin to realize that you have to protect the environment, that industrialization is destroying the environment. So what Roosevelt does and what Roosevelt's government does is set aside certain areas and create a service to manage these areas. It was also during this period that you get the period known as Prohibition, which prohibited alcohol consumption. This was passed with the 18th Amendment in 1920. So the idea that drunkenness is such a problem in society that an amendment was passed to ban alcohol use throughout the country. Obviously, we've heard stories of bootleggers, underground alcohol consumption, things like this. And eventually, the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. But for 13 years, the United States had a ban nationwide on alcohol consumption. There were also initiatives to strengthen democracy. This led to the system of primaries, where voters pick candidates rather than the corrupt political machines. This led to the 17th Amendment, which meant the direct election of senators. That meant the people vote for the senators rather than the senators are chosen by the state legislators. It created the initiative movement where people can create laws directly, referendums where people vote on an issue for themselves, and the recall where people can recall a candidate in a special election. So they basically vote a candidate out of office. So this gives the people, the voters, more rights than they had and kind of moves away from those corrupt political machines that had been in place before. So the Progressive Era also involved the rights of women, in particular the voting rights of women. So the 19th Amendment was passed on August 18, 1920, which gave women the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul were particularly important in this and getting the movement going. And they worked for the National American Women Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. And what these women did as part of the NAWSA was they created a advertisement campaign, and they kind of created a campaign that showed women's contributions during World War I. So this is after World War I, they were showing women had helped out, they had done all these things. they should have the right to vote. And so finally, the women's movement the modern women's movement, which had begun at the Seneca Falls Convention, reaches ahead with women are finally given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So while there was a lot of progress being made, there was a dark side to progressivism. During this period, racism grows. You can see here a march on the Capitol by the Ku Klux Klan. What happens is whites worried that they were going to lose their jobs to African Americans. They were afraid of a colorblind society, and they strived to create a social order in which African Americans were legally forced to the bottom. So they had done this through Jim Crow laws, but as society, as government is enforcing more and more, they become more afraid that this is going to end. However, African Americans were finding new roles, leaving the Jim Crow South. So as part of the Great Migration, African Americans began to move to the north. They were moving to northern cities, seeking better job opportunities and improved quality of life. They were also trying to escape the pervasive discrimination of the South. They're trying to get away from this discrimination, the segregation. But when they moved to the northern cities, they were often met by racism. This was not an equal society in the northern cities by any means. One of the more predominant reformers in the African American community was Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born a slave up the road here in Moneta, actually, near Smith Mountain Lake. There's a national monument built up there if you ever want to go look at it. It's pretty interesting. But anyway, Booker T. Washington believed that the idea of racism was deeply ingrained in society, that this wasn't going to change overnight. But he thought that it would be possible to have a gradual earned equality. He thought that he would accept segregation in the short term, but thought that eventually that African Americans could prove their worth, could work their way up in society, and eventually earn equality. So what he promoted was the idea of vocational education as a key to equality. That is, African Americans would learn a trade, learn trades, get better at them, become integral to society, and therefore they would become equal. Booker T. Washington put these ideas to work when he created the Tuskegee Institute, which is a college he founded. This college had academic courses, but it also had a lot of vocational courses. And that's what you see here with the construction classes, the woodworking classes. They were trying to teach African Americans how to do good jobs and become an integral part of society to hopefully one day get equality. W.E.B. Du Bois was another African American reformer, but he took a very different stance from Washington. Du Bois was a college professor. He was an intellectual. He lived in New York City. What he thought was that we need immediate equality. We're not going to stand for segregation now. We want equality now. And so Du Bois is famous for creating the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which is still an active organization that protests and works for the rights of African Americans in the country. And we also have Ida Wells Barnett, who was a African American activist who launched a national campaign against lynching. And you can see here with the advancement of photography, the horrors of these pictures. You can see this spreading the idea, but her idea was to try to end that form of terrible violence against African Americans. However, society remained extremely racist. Jim Crow laws had been deemed constitutional in the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. That Supreme Court case said that separate but equal facilities were legal. So you could have separate facilities, but they had to be equal. Obviously, separating people in society makes them inherently unequal, and the whole goal behind those laws was to create a segregated society in which white people would be supreme. The system of lynching still existed, and racism characterized the North as well as the South. There wasn't as much legalized discrimination, but there was still, racism was rampant. They still had separate societies. It was not a society where races worked together, really, where races congregated together. Racism was rampant throughout the entire country. Of course, you also have ethnic discrimination, as we've seen in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And you can see this depiction here of Uncle Sam kicking out a Chinese person, of people chasing away Chinese people. The Chinese must go. So there was discrimination throughout society. There was racism throughout society. It was also during this period that the system of eugenics took place in the United States. Eugenics was an idea that was born out of scientific movements, out of the idea of Darwinism, out of the idea of survival of the fittest, and the idea was that you could eliminate undesirable characteristics from the society. Obviously, this has a horribly racist undertone, and we'll see how terrible these ideas could go with a system like in Nazi Germany. But eugenics took place in the United States in this early 20th century period. A good summation of the eugenics movement is this picture taken here of a family that just won the Fitter Family Contest in Kansas. This is a eugenics contest to see which family is most ideal, both physically and mentally. So they're giving a system of tests, and this is the best family they decided on. The eugenics movement took a particularly dark move with the passage of a Virginia law that would be taken all the way to the Supreme Court. So who you see here, that is Carrie Bell on the left there with her mother. And what happens is Virginia law basically stated that people who were deemed not mentally capable, people who are mentally handicapped should not be allowed to have children. And so Oliver Wendell Holmes, was a Supreme Court justice, and in his decision on the case, he stated that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And the Supreme Court upheld the law, and basically what this law said is that the forced sterilization of the genetically unfit. So what that means is that if you were deemed genetically unfit, usually mentally handicapped, you could be sterilized. That is, not allowed to have kids. So this upheld the Virginia law. This law was then extended to 30 states, and 65,000 Americans were sterilized after this law against their own wishes. So they were deemed incapable of having children based on the idea that the government had decided that they are mentally incapable, that they are a burden to society. So you can see here really the darkness of the progressive movement. So the progressive movement did do a lot of good for society, use the government as a tool for good, but it also enforced racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination. And then the idea of eugenics, that the state can decide who can have babies. And you'll see these movements, the real problems of this, problems with like eugenics, with government takeover and things such as Nazi Germany. So it's scary to look at some of the seeds of this in the United States, but you can really see the dark side and the good side of the progressive movement.